Hey everybody, hello and welcome to today's podcast. With us on hand today, we've got
Evan. Hey everyone.
Our number one tall guy, number two tall guy, Bretton Hamilton.
Small fry Chloe. Woo!
And today for guest stars, we have the young and shining
Henry Zurawski.
He does our art.
And the lead designer and lead programmer, or the
Project Lead.
The project lead working on Skullgirls at the moment, Mike Zaimont.
Hello.
So Mike, I thought we'd get things started off today by you telling everybody, who you are, how you got to do what you're doing now.
Okay. I'm Mike Z, and I was the project lead on Skullgirls, which is a fighting game that came out a while ago and just received an update. I've been working in video games for a long time. Like, I worked at Pandemic Studios back before they closed, that Force Studio. And I got to be doing what I'm doing by being a video game tester first. I went to grad school at UCLA, and Pandemic had flyers up all over the school grounds that were, hey, you want to be a video game tester? Come play video games at Pandemic because we give you free food. And after being pressured for long enough that I finally actually went and I applied, and it was really, really fun. And I'd wanted to make video games for a long time, but I didn't have any idea how to get into it, and I figured it had to be when you were done with school and, everybody really cared about formal education and all the rest. That turns out not to be the case. So I went the, old school traditional route of being a tester first and then impressing the people at the company enough that they give you a programming test or design test or whatever, and then you go on to actually work there.
Okay, very cool, very cool. So for those just tuning in who haven't heard of Skullgirls, can you explain what Skullgirls is?
Sure. Skullgirls is a 2D fighting game. That's the easy explanation. The longer explanation is Skullgirls is an indie fighting game by a group of people that had been working separately initially for 10 years, and we happened to meet each other, and I was making an engine and Alex was making art, and those are the two things that you need for a fighting game. So we got together and we made it, and it's kind of an homage to the older fighting games before there were back mechanics and other stuff that I will probably get into later on. But yeah, it was an experiment in a lot of ways because it's a downloadable game specifically. We tried to start with a small roster and then continue on and add characters later, and we found out that there are lots of inherent business problems in video games, and sometimes you make mistakes that you can't come back from.
Okay, so Henry, did you want to?
I was going to ask if there's any of those problems that you've come across that you think would be good to kind of get out there for anyone else who's starting up in the industry, business creation. What are some of the things that you've seen people run into or run into yourself that were maybe easily avoidable?
So the huge takeaway from Skullgirls is, and this is useful to anyone in any field, don't give away ownership of your IP unless you are extremely comfortable with doing it and you are very confident in the people that you're giving it to. In the U.S. specifically, if you're a small team and you want to find a publisher to have people fund your project, it is the standard practice for the publisher to ask you to give them your IP. No matter who you are, even Tim Schafer has to give up his IPs, and if he didn't want to, for Brutal Legend, I think, you face all kinds of penalties. They won't fund you as much, and they won't do all other stuff because they don't get something that they can take advantage of after the game is done. But yeah, the takeaway from Skullgirls is if you give up your IP, then you no longer have control of it, which most people don't care about at the beginning of a project because oh man, they're going to fund us and it's going to be great. We're going to make this game. These people are awesome. They brought us cake. When you reach the end of the project or if the person that you're working with ends up having problems and you don't own the IP anymore, then there isn't anything that you can do with it. And that doesn't seem like a big deal at the beginning, but it's a big deal. So the takeaway from Skullgirls is keep your IP. I guess I didn't define IP ever. IP is intellectual property, which is if you create a character, if you create a game engine, if you create a piece of music, if you write a story, whatever, you automatically own that intellectual property. It is yours because you created it, as long as you can prove that you created it, obviously. When you sign away the rights to that, you no longer own that intellectual property, which means, for example, with Skullgirls, anything associated with Skullgirls, like merchandising or coming up with new things that you want to do with it or extending the game in other ways, those decisions are no longer made by you. And at the beginning of the project, again, it may not seem like a huge deal, but when it's over, and also at the beginning of the project, it may not seem like it will ever be over. That was definitely the case on Skullgirls. It was like, hey, it's totally shipping next week. You know, you never think you're actually going to get to that spot.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so at the beginning of the project, it doesn't seem that bad to give up your IP, but because of all of the concessions that you'll have to make if you don't. But at the end of the project, it can turn into a huge thing.
Absolutely.
Trying to put that very nicely.
So real quick, as an indie developer, you know, kind of what are your thoughts as opposed to, like, I know Kickstarter and other crowdfunding things are beginning to take a big rise, and you have personally had some issues with, you know, publishing. What's kind of your thought process regarding Kickstarter and crowdfunding?
So first, crowdfunding is excellent. The fact that you can get money from people that are actually interested in your project and also demonstrate that there is interest for your project at the same time is really great. However, from everything that I have heard from people getting involved in Kickstarter, there are large downsides the more money that you need or try to raise. Like, for example, Kickstarter takes a percentage, right? Which means if you want to raise, I'll just use $1 million because it's easy. If you want to raise $1 million, then Kickstarter takes whatever 5% is. So you have to actually raise $1,050,000. I can totally add, right?
I think, yeah.
And that's your actual goal if you want to get $1 million. But then there's also, you need to make the video. You need to basically employ a full-time PR person to handle fan demands because people act very, very entitled when they have invested in a project. You have to pay for the goodies at each level, depending on what you're giving out. That's a lot of money or a little money, depending. And there's the issue of, like, people can back out. I don't know. I mean, nobody talks about this very much, but, for example, you can pledge $15 for a Kickstarter, and then later on you can call up Amazon and say, yo, I totally didn't mean to pledge $15 for this, and since they haven't actually taken the money yet, Amazon can just be like, okay, well then I guess you didn't. What that means for the people behind the project is, first of all, they're out the money that you donated plus whatever percentage of it Kickstarter was going to take, because you now need to raise that extra percent. And if you want to fight it, then Amazon charges you a fee to contest the customer's claim, so you're out the $10 or whatever that costs. And if 150 people decide that they really want to do that because they're no longer satisfied with what the project is going to be, then you lose a ton of money to Amazon and a ton of money to Kickstarter and the money that they were actually donating in the first place. I guess I don't mean to sound super negative, but the other part of Kickstarter is, since it's largely based on perceived value of your product, for example, budgets for video games are usually a lot bigger than people think they are, and the public never really has to deal with that, right? You go and buy a game and it's $60, which is kind of steep for a game, or $20 or $15 online, and you look at that game and you go, this game is worth $20 to me. But when you actually see, like, Kickstarter needs to raise $400,000 or $1.5 million or whatever it is for a video game, consumers go, that's a lot of money. Like, I don't know if I want to back this. What are they doing with all of that money? Whereas when you go and talk to publishers go, oh yeah, no, I've funded, Guitar Hero, and I know that this game is going to cost us like $3 million, and you want gold toilet seats, no problem. Give us your IP.
Coming back to
but
that.
yeah, so there are upsides and downsides to Kickstarter. From what I have heard, it's a lot more difficult than everyone makes it out to be. A, to raise the money that you need unless you already have the cachet that would let you fund it through a publisher. And B, I'm kind of curious what's going to happen when the games that have been Kickstartered actually come out. Because, like, none of the large projects, like the thing from Obsidian or anything like that, have actually released yet.
Yeah.
So there is the expectation from people, I think, that they're going to be, you know, AAA games with all the bells and whistles that spending $40 million on a game gets you. And I'm really curious whether they will turn out to be anything close to that, or whether people will be really upset and the bubble will burst, or what will actually happen.
Absolutely.
Being a realist really sucks.
Well, because I know like video games get up there to, you know, multi-million dollar budgets, and I see all these Kickstarters that are only like 500,000, 750,000,
Yeah.
and I'm really
Yeah,
curious.
you have to remember that you're going to get what you're paying for out of that. And like that's another thing for Skullgirls is like we've already put the number out there so I can actually mention it. Like it was already public information. But if we were going to Kickstarter it, it would be like $200,000 to $250,000 per character,
Absolutely.
which to consumers like that's a ton of money. What are you doing with all of that money?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Since I have now talked to people that have worked on other fighting games like Street Fighter 4 and King of Fighters, I'm not going to say their budgets because that's
Private.
NDA.
Yeah.
we should be aid. But what our stuff costs is like a fraction of what characters for other fighting games cost. I mean, I have talked to people, other developers now, that have had characters for their games that cost less than our whole game costs.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
in terms of producing a game, we were exceptionally cheap. But when you try to talk to consumers about that, it sounds like a ton of money. So that's the hurdle that crowdsourcing needs to be able to overcome before you be able to see real things come out of it. Like the Ouya, for example, right? $2 million they raised for their development of their game system. Compared to Sony and Microsoft investing hundreds of millions of dollars in the development of their console. I'm not saying that Ouya is going to suck, because I'm really hoping it does well, and I pre-ordered and everything. But the order of magnitude of money that you can raise for a given project from crowdsourcing is totally different, because the people that you're asking for money don't have the scale that publishers already have of what these projects are really going to cost. And they see something like a fighting game costing $250,000 for a character, or backing an Obsidian game for, I think they were initially asking for like $450,000, and they think that's a lot of money. I could get a ton of stuff for that. But that's not how it actually worked out. So the whole thing kind of scares me, and I'm waiting to see how the first round actually ends up.
So do you think?
And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask. So do you think maybe publishing the budgets for these games more would help people kind of understand that making games is not cheap? It's just as expensive, if not in some cases more expensive, than making a feature-length movie? It
would help, but you're not going to convince companies to publish their budgets. That's
Absolutely.
the thing they don't want to do.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so out of curiosity, as an indie publisher, you know, what was the process you went through to pitch your game to a publisher, or how did you make that initial connection with Autumn, or what was the process you went through to get your game from just two guys, you know, or a couple guys sitting around a room to getting the funding you guys need?
How did Skullgirls happen? I think it's what I was asking.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess I can give you the beginning of that. The beginning of it is I was working on a fighting game engine since like 1999, because I had a really cool professor in college that let me do Dreamcast programming to get credit in his class.
Nice.
The Dreamcast is an awesome system for homebrew, by the way, and I highly recommend it for people that don't know anything about graphics programming, because the Power VR chip in the Dreamcast does all of this stuff that you normally have to do by hand for you. If you're a nerd, you should look it up. If anyone here wants to actually ask questions, you totally should. But, oh man, that system ruined me for 3D programming. When I found out that you had to sort stuff and call stuff yourself on other platforms, it's just like, why is that the case? Anyway, so I was working on the engine since 99, and it turns out Alex was also making characters since 99, and basically I started working at Pandemic, and I was porting my engine to like all the dev kits that they had lying around the office. Like it's got a PS2 version and an Xbox One version and a Wii version and whatever. Or the old version of the engine had that. So he had started already, like, he'd gotten people together and made SD, standard res versions of the characters like this, because everything started before HDTV existed. And he had a demo of the game, and he was working with another programmer. I think he like switched programmers twice or whatever. So he had an established team, and then I found out through one of my friends that plays Guilty Gear that knew Alex that he was doing this. So I decided to ask, you know, can I use your art because it's copyright free, and it would mean that I can stop having Chun-Li that turns into Zangief and Spiral in my game engine, and not get sued. And I don't want to like interrupt your project or anything. I just want to use the art. So he said okay, and he let me use all the art for, at that point, Philia, and I made a character out of her. And as a thank you, I sent him back a build that had the character in it, and his whole team basically said, "Well, this is a lot better than what our current programmer is doing. We'd like to work with you." So
I feel
my
bad
apologies
for
to the other programmer, but
Dog world.
so, huh?
I said it's a dog-eat world when you're a programmer.
What is it? It's a dog stabs dog in the back and then eats dog world.
What? I'm sorry, I lost the reference.
I actually don't remember what that's from. I think it might be like Bernard and the Genie or something really old and terrible. I love Bernard and the Genie, but I totally... Anyway, so I met him and I started actually working on the game, and at that point, pandemic closed. I cannot stress enough to people who want to be indie developers, and I actually get this question a lot. People say, so I'm on an indie development team and we want to make a fighting game, because it's usually a fighting game that people are talking to me about, and the other people on the team are all out of work or college students or whatever, and I have a job, and I don't want to quit my job, so how can I convince them that I'm doing everything that I can do? Because I go to work, and then I come home and I work on this game for like 6 hours every day after work. How can I convince them that I'm doing everything that it's within my power to do? The answer is you can't, because you're not. Right? If you have a stable job and this project goes nowhere, then you have a stable job, and the other people on the project get nothing and have to go out and get jobs flipping burgers or selling apparel or whatever. If you really want to put yourself in the same boat as them, then you have to give up the stability, which is really difficult for people to do. So when pandemic closed, it gave me a chance. Like, they asked if I wanted to stay on and work at EA, and I said, no, thank you very much. It gave me a chance to give up the stability and actually devote all my time to this, and you'd be surprised, like, what a difference that actually makes for you as an indie developer. I didn't have to think about anything else. I didn't have to change gears. I was able to get a lot more done. I was able to feel a lot more resentment for Alex, who still had a job at that point. It was wonderful. Anyway, so how did we actually pitch the game? This is a really good story, much better than the rest of this story that I was telling. We had a demo. We had Philia versus Philia on New Meridian, or on like a couple of test stages. And we brought it to a bunch of places. Like, we pitched to Ubisoft, and we pitched to EA, I think. Yeah, we totally pitched to EA and a bunch of other places. And we got kind of good at gauging how interested people actually were. Like, you pitch to a group of people that may or may not have anything invested in wanting your game to succeed or even wanting to make that type of game. You get questions like, it looks like all of the characters are the same height. Why are they the same height? Or, oh, I mean, for real, we got that one. That was an actual question that was asked. And then they looked at, like, the extended roster, which I'm sorry that no one online has been able to see. But, and they said, like, those characters at the end are way more interesting. Why aren't you doing those first? And then we had to answer, well, there's also the plot and how everything works out together, and you kind of have to do the beginning before you do the end. You get questions like, what was it? What is the frame rate of your attacks? Was one that was actually asked, and you have to not turn to the person and say, you have no idea what you're talking about, do you? You just really want to be intelligent in front of the rest of the people here.
I just want to say frame rate. I just wanted to say frame rate.
Yeah, like, you get questions that are asked by people that know nothing about the game that you're trying to make because they're marketing people and they're looking at it from the perspective of, will this be able to sell? Whatever. They probably don't play very many video games, and it's kind of disappointing. It is there was a book that I wish I could remember the name of. I actually have it upstairs. That was stories from someone who used to do business in LA. He wrote stories that he read on the radio, and I have a book of them. And he used to talk about all the time, you never know in a business meeting what it is that's going to make the other person really want to work with you, but it's usually not your business plan. And that's totally the truth in the case of at least Skullgirls. And obviously you have to have a business plan, and it has to not be, we're going to embezzle half of the money. But when you're talking to another person, the things that make them want to work with you are like your sincerity, your motivation, your perceived level of knowledge. I mean, like one of the things that ISM, which was the agents that we used for a period of time, they didn't normally represent companies that had never shipped anything. But one of them came and talked to me about the game, and I was talking about how Sentinel and Fastfly worked in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and like what we were planning to do with Painwheel, and he just kind of stopped and looked at me and was like, "Oh, you really know what you're talking about? Okay." So the thing that actually sold Skullgirls was this. We were in a meeting with Autumn, and we'd had a bunch of different meetings with different groups of people, and we were in the meeting with Autumn, and our business people were talking to their business people in one corner of the room, and one of the guys was over with me, and I was teaching him how to play because he'd previously played fighting games at some point. So I taught him how to do a fireball, and I taught him how to do a dragon punch, and then this was with Philia again. So I taught him how to do a dragon punch, and then I was like, okay, so now you can do supers, so do a dragon punch and hit these two buttons at the same time. So he did it, and after a couple of tries, he finally got it right, and she did Fenrir Drive, which is her DP super, and she, like, basically the parasite that's her hair turns into like a giant mouth with rotating teeth and goes up for a bunch of hits, and then at the top of it he turns into a wolf and chomps the opponent and goes down and slams him into the floor. So he did that, and all the people from Autumn at the other end of the room stopped talking and turned around and said, "Do that again." So he did it again, and then they said, "We're going to have a second meeting with you."
Well.
So you don't know what it is that other people are going to see in the thing that you're making, but you want to have as good a showing as you possibly can. And another thing to take away from this is a demo is always more useful than not.
Okay.
Telling people that it's going to be lots of fun or it's going to work this way is always less useful than, here, play this thing.
Having something concrete.
Yeah.
Had you tried giving the demo to the other publishers and they just didn't take, or?
Oh, one of the reasons that a bunch of publishers even agreed to see us was because we said we had a playable demo.
Oh, very nice. So I guess that stresses the importance.
So out of curiosity, what were some of the aspects or features of your game that when you went to go pitch this, you were a little more flexible about, oh, well, they say we can only do this many characters, or they say they want this. What were you a little bit more flexible on, and what exactly, where did you stand your ground? Like say, hey, no, there's going to be this story, there's going to be these key features.
We actually got to stand our ground on pretty much everything because it turns out no one has any idea what goes into a fighting game if they haven't made one before. Like, no one. I mean, we had to convince publishers, for example, that it wasn't a good idea to make a game with 3 characters and then add more later because, hey, you make an FPS with 3 maps and people will still play it, right? It's the same thing. No, I'm not joking. Like, it's a level of stuff that we had to deal with at other publishers. Like, I have to thank Street Fighter 4, whatever anyone thinks of the actual game. I have to thank Street Fighter 4 because if Street Fighter 4 hadn't shown publishers that you could actually make money from producing a fighting game now, we would never even have been seen, let alone signed.
Absolutely. So
the fighting game genre as a whole owes kind of their continued existence to SF4. And as developers, we can't forget that. I mean, we're competing with them, but at some point you have to be able to make a business case.
Absolutely.
So, what do you think, or how do you think, the evolution of fighting games, how they've been, I guess, portrayed in the industry, or like how do you think they stand today, and like what the future for fighting games is? Like, is there a future, or is it kind of falling behind?
You mean portrayed to like the rest of the game industry? I would doubt that they look at fighting games as anything other than going to be a niche forever. I've given something like probably over 80 in-depth interviews of showing off Skullgirls mechanics and stuff like that. There was the GDC before it came out. I did like 35 in like 3 days. It was amazing. But what you get, and this is like, I have to say this because this is one of those things that I always talk about with people, but I never actually get to say in public, which is game journalism is extremely upsetting if you're making a fighting game or a beat 'em up or anything that's apparently not a first-person shooter, an RPG, or a racing game or a sports game at this point. When I would give interviews to people, half the game journalists would come in and say, I don't play fighting games. Do something cool and tell me what you're doing. And another group would come in and say, oh, yeah, no, I totally play these. And, like, pick up the controller and go, you know, like, I'm just hit buttons and see what happens. Some of them would know how to block, whatever. I should say, for example, like, Jonathan Holmes from Destructoid?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I'm going to get reamed if that was wrong. But anyway, he's awesome. He was knowledgeable. He knew what questions he wanted to ask. He knew how to play the game. He played with one hand with the microphone in the other hand, asking intelligent questions and actually, like, doing well. It was really impressive. And, like, that's the standard that game journalism should have with respect to fighting games. If you look at, for example, the review from a leading game journalism site that I will not mention the name of for Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 when it came out, the review was basically, so they added a couple characters and some stages, and then they didn't really do very much to the rest of the game, and so it's totally, like, really not worth buying because the other game, like, just came out very recently, so if you're just going to mash buttons, it's not all that great. When, in reality, they changed a ton of stuff about the underlying engine. They changed a lot about the returning cast. Like, it's a completely different game from regular MVC3, but the reviewer didn't go into any depth about it. Contrasting that with that same site's review of, like, Call of Duty, for example, he talks about, so I dropped in and I picked this loadout and I went into the fight and it had these disadvantages and I didn't really like it. So I switched to a different loadout and it had these other advantages, disadvantages that I didn't really like. And then someone suggested that I try this third loadout. So I tried it and it was really great because the perks that you got were, like, amazing. And then he goes into all this detail and it's just such a huge contrast from them talking about fighting games that it's depressing almost.
Absolutely.
The same thing happened to, like, beat 'em ups. Like, for example, Double Dragon Neon came out recently. If you read the joystick review of Double Dragon Neon, it's basically, the music is awesome, the game is really pretty, and the gameplay is you run around and hit buttons, but the rest of it is totally great. And, like, I probably shouldn't mention in public my opinion of Double Dragon Neon, but the gameplay in something like that is really important. And they spent 2 sentences on it, and they gave it, I think, a 4.5 out of 5.
Seems a little odd for a game.
For example, IGN gave it like a 3 out of 10 because that guy plays beat 'em ups and was not impressed with the way that the game worked. Like, high-profile game journalism sites don't review fighting games and beat 'em ups the right way a lot. I mean, for example, IGN reviewed Double Dragon Neon a lot more barely, but a lot of times it's just like you get assigned to write the fighting game review and then you do it.
Which is a shame. I feel like sites should kind of have more of an expert on the genres because when it comes to fighting games, they're very intricate, and I almost think you can't write a review off the bat because if we take a look at, like, Street Fighter Cross Tekken, there was a lot of hype for it, and it's almost completely fallen off without Capcom's, constant resuscitation of it.
Yeah, you want that game to stay alive, you put a car as the prize of the tournament.
Exactly, and I think it's kind of a shame that they just write a review instantly, and it's usually a person who doesn't play fighting games often and isn't kind of in touch with the community when the community is honestly half, if not like more, of your audience.
Yeah. So this was all in reference to your what is the game industry, or what do you think fighting games are going to be to the rest of the game industry?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of that, right? The reason I brought up game journalism is because they're a reflection of how the rest of the industry views fighting games. It's very difficult to convince companies that they should make a fighting game because the initial cost is more than everyone thinks it is. Like, we had a group of people talk to us about wanting to make a game because we've been pitching other projects since the end of Skullgirls, or the ship of Skullgirls, I should say. And like, we had a developer that wanted to work with us and thought that we could make it for like, $50,000 or whatever. And this is the way that publishers actually look at this genre of game, is like, there's nothing in it, so it can't cost very much, right? Like, you can just churn those out no matter what. And this is how we got things like War Gods, for example. Right? You can make a fighting game out of anything. And it's kind of sad to have been pitching other stuff to other companies, because you kind of have to explain to them what a fighting game actually takes and what you're actually likely to get from it, and the fact that, for example, a sequel is nearly free, but the first game isn't nearly free. And it's hard, because when you talk to companies that have made fighting games before, or when you talk to companies that have made things that are somewhat in the fighting game vein, like, I don't know, an MMA game or something like that, and they go, well, it didn't do very well, so we don't want to make fighting games anymore. It's sad, because they don't understand what they needed to do to go into it, so they don't understand whether the game is good or bad, and they just look at it as, well, so we made a good game and nobody wanted to play it, as maybe this game was actually not great. Like, there isn't that level of knowledge in most of the video game industry about how you can tell a good fighting game from a bad fighting game. I mean, they know that about FPSs at this point. If you pitch an FPS and you talk about, like, we made Turok 2 or whatever. I actually don't remember if Turok 2 was any good, but
it wasn't.
Okay, thank you. Cool. Or that one where you were the American Indian and when you died, you had to fight your way out of the spirit world, that got super hype, and then
Prey
came out.
Prey.
Everybody was like, I don't know what this game is. People at other game companies can play it and tell that it's bad or not. But if you don't have the background for fighting games, because they require a background and they do a terrible job of teaching people how to play them, other companies just look at it and go, well, it's got all the requisite, like, attacks and stuff like that, but this Bloody Roar 3 just didn't really do very well, so we should make fighting games.
I guess, speaking of backgrounds, would you like to go, like, I guess, with your background with fighting games? I'm sure you played a lot, like, probably Marvel vs. Capcom, Virtua Fighter, stuff like that. King of Fighters. What kind of fighting games did you play, or still play? I guess?
Yeah, well, Skullgirls. So I grew up playing Street Fighter because it was what was there. I actually didn't play most of the earlier King of Fighters. Like, I got into 98 in, I don't know, 2004. But so I really got started with games that a lot of people, I guess, don't remember or didn't play, like Mace the Dark Age and Killer Instinct and stuff.
I remember Killer Instinct. Yeah. I remember Killer Instinct. Yeah.
Killer Instinct, but nobody remembers Mace, which is a shame.
Sorry.
But anyway, so I played all of that. I played X-Men vs. Street Fighter pretty well. I really started getting into things with Marvel vs. Capcom 2 because I made a video to get Vasanth to shut up because he was like, there aren't going to be any infinites in this game. They finally got this right. So,
well,
so I made the first fighting game video I made was specifically to prove Vasanth wrong. And it worked because I found an infinite. But from there, I made more combo videos, and I came up with a bunch of tech that ended up being used in gameplay like to this day, and I really enjoyed it. I play Third Strike for 10 years, and everybody online tells me I suck whenever they comment in the Shoryuken forums. Thank you, everyone. So Third Strike, Marvel 2, Guilty Gear is absolutely fantastic. The first 3 were incredibly broken, but as the people at Arc Systems said, every failure teaches you how to be a better success, which I thought was actually really excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When you make a bad game or you make a bad prototype or whatever, you can use it to figure out what you did wrong and to never make those mistakes again. When you put a new team on it and you start developing BB, you make a whole different set of mistakes that you then have to fix up again. But it's always better to have more things. This was actually, I guess you didn't ask this question, but I've been asked this question before of like, why do people say that the U.S. can't make fighting games? And a lot of it is because the Japanese companies have tons of fighting games that they've already made. They can look at them and know how the development process should work, what failed, what worked really well. I mean, there was Capcom Fighting Jam, which completely died. Like, yeah, American companies usually don't have that kind of history, so they make one and it does badly and they don't do anything else with it. You know, I mean, for however many years the games were absolutely terrible, I have to applaud Mortal Kombat for sticking with it, because they came out with something that was pretty good at the end of all of that. I mean, they started with some stuff that was pretty good, which was why they kept on getting funded and also bloody.
Blood and gore.
But what?
I said blood and gore. It's America.
Yeah, well, but I mean, MK2 is an amazing game. Like, gameplay-wise, it's really, really excellent. I'm going to go turn that phone off. Sorry.
Go ahead, don't worry.
We can edit it, don't worry.
So, you have to be able to treat failures as stepping stones to success rather than just failures. And especially in today's video game industry, it's really difficult to like talk to publishers about that. And it's difficult to have failures, right? If you're spending $45-50 million on a video game, you cannot have it fail. You can't take risks. You can't do anything outside the box, because if it doesn't work, then you wasted $45 or $50 million. And the investors that are investing aren't investing in, for example, Fez, where they're like, this game is pretty freaking awesome and I really want to have something to do with it. They're investing in a business opportunity that is going to give them a guaranteed return. And they will be very angry if you don't provide that for them. So the higher your budget gets, the more difficult it is to convince companies to take risks, and the more difficult it is to pitch games that cost more than $6.
Well, I don't know how many games out there cost $6, but
Like tic-tac-toe.
make a new Connect 4.
All right.
So real quick, how exactly have you guys tried to stay competitive to compete with like Capcom and Namco and some of the other like fighting game franchises?
How have we tried to stay competitive? I mean, I guess the easy answer to that is we tried to make a game that was as useful as, or as good as commercial fighting games. Like, obviously, we couldn't put all of the money into bells and whistles. Like, we didn't have tons of advertising. We didn't have tons of online features, which kind of makes me sad. But when you have one networking guy,
Yeah.
you do everything you can. We tried to do as much as we could do the right way. And I guess I can explain that slightly better. For example, sorry, I muted myself, yay. For example, we use GGPO, which is something that I don't understand why game developers have avoided using until now. It makes the networking process so much easier. It gives players can choose to have the same laggy gameplay that they really enjoy in games, or they can choose to have their own character respond to their own inputs immediately. There is zero reason for game companies to not use GGPO. So we decided to do that because it deserves to be in fighting games. And like, now that the patch has come out, you know, US and Japan can play with no lag. Like, presto, it's been there for 6 or 7 years now. Companies just avoided doing it. We did button config on the character select. We did proper button config where you just hit the buttons in order and then they show up as what attack it's supposed to be, rather than having to go into a match and then see what your buttons are and then choose from a menu and scroll through a bunch of different options and memorize where the triangle button is on your stick that's not labeled. Like, and then quit that match and go back to the character select and repick. Like, we tried to do as much as we could within fighting games the way that it seems like they should have been done. Putting in features that were suggested by fans. Come on.
Hold on one second.
Putting in features that were suggested by fans, like holding down or having to hold down the start button to pause rather than just accidentally pressing it. We did as much as we could within the actual game, like custom assist types, right? Instead of just giving you 3 predetermined assist types, you can choose any grounded, normal, or special move or throw or dash or whatever, allowing you to alpha counter in the air, showing who's in the life lead at the top of the screen with the word leader over the correct side. Like, there's all this stuff that fighting games could do to make themselves more approachable that they just don't do because they have, so much momentum now. And, like, if you make a Street Fighter, it has to be a Street Fighter, right? Ryu has to have a Dragon Punch. He has to have a Fireball. At this point, he has to have some sort of Super Fireball. He probably has to have a Donkey Kick. Like, there's a huge legacy of stuff that Capcom cannot change about Street Fighter if they want to call it a Street Fighter. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have any kind of encumbrance on that. We didn't have any background that we needed to adhere to, so we tried to do as much as possible to be the way that fighting games should have changed, right? Doing things like protecting the player from high-low unblockables, which also isn't in any other game, and I don't understand why not. Having a tutorial mode that actually teaches you the basics that you need to play a fighting game, like how to do mix-ups and how to punish things that are minus on block, as opposed to just, here's how you do combos and then we're done. It was harder. It was definitely harder to implement that than it was to just say, do jab strong fierce launch. But in the end, like, that's the stuff that fighting games needed to be. Even in the patch, we did things like tournament mode, right? Which isn't what tournament mode has been in other games, which is like you can run a tournament on this console. Like, you enter player names and stuff like that. It streamlined the way that the user interface works so that it would work better at tournaments, right? You choose which side your controller is on, then you say, or you automatically are forced to go through button config before you even get the character select. Then you pick your character, you play the match. It always uses the default settings for rounds and time, because even if you change something in the options, like there was one of the EVOs, the Marvel vs. Capcom 2 finals, it took 2 games for someone to realize that it was actually set to infinite time.
Did they restart those matches?
No, because it didn't go long enough that it would have mattered.
Oh, okay.
But it's things to help mistakes like that not happen, right? The really good one for tournament mode for us is at the end of the match menu, when it says, change character, change stage, go back to the main menu, whatever. If anyone unplugs the controller, it automatically goes back to the controller select screen. And that does 2 things. The first one is when new people come up and plug their sticks in, they can immediately choose what side they're on, as opposed to having to like remap their controllers or get up and switch chairs or whatever. Wow, I made getting up and switching chairs sound like a huge amount of work. But the other thing that showing the controller select screen lets you do is it lists all the controllers that are attached to the system, so you can see if someone forgot to disconnect their DualShock or their wireless pad, which is really helpful because tournaments have basically banned wireless controllers because of this exact problem. People forgetting to disconnect and then hitting like the home button in the middle of the next match. So I guess that's my very long-winded answer for how did we attempt to compete. We attempted to compete by making a game that was as good as what they were making, minus all of the things that don't really have to do with the game itself.
Okay, so do you think that the bigger name studios don't put these things in because they just don't have a pulse on the community, or why do you think they don't put those things in? Because those are all, stuff that would just help tournaments go better, make the game more tournament viable.
Well, I really hate to give examples from other games, but there are actual examples from other games. Like, look at the tournament mode gem picking thing for Cross Tekken, right? Do you know how that works?
I'm slightly familiar. Isn't there a number representing gem combinations?
Yeah, you have to scroll through which gem you want. It doesn't give you the name of it or anything. It's just a number.
Yeah.
Within, I think, immediately when they put up how that was going to work, there was a tweet from Tom Cannon or Tony Cannon detailing a UI flow that would be better than what's actually in the game. Like, you can do a bunch of things there. They could have presented the gems in groups of 6 and allowed you to push, jab, strong, fierce, short, forward, or roundhouse to pick the appropriate gem from that group, and it would have had names so that you get to scroll through the groups in groups of 6. They could have not had you have to set up gems per character before you pick that character, just allow you to set up a gem set for character 1 and a gem set for character 2. Because as far as I remember, you still have to set them up for, like, if you want to play Ryu, you have to go set up Ryu's gems. Then you have to go set up Nina's gems if she's going to be your second character.
Mm-hmm.
There's that disconnect makes no sense in general in the UI. Everybody looks at, for example, Capcom as having a legacy of having made amazing fighting games. We don't know how many of the people that made the amazing fighting games are still around, right? Like, one of the things that I say about Street Fighter 4, which is going to get me a ton of flack, is it was made by people that know how a fighting game is supposed to look, but not how a fighting game is supposed to work, until Seth stepped in and actually told them some things about how a fighting game is supposed to work. Looking at the design of, like, Makoto in Third Strike versus Makoto in Super when she was first introduced, or Dudley in Third Strike and Dudley in Super, shows you this. Like, Makoto in Third Strike was designed around all of her mix-ups leaving you in mix-up range again, right? Everything ends in a rush punch, and you can command grab, or you can low, or you can block after that. Whereas in Super, all of her mix-ups that ended in a rush punch put you out of range for more mix-ups. And sure, they corrected it, but, like, in later games, but, like, that type of thing shows that you don't know why the character is actually the way that they are. You just made them look like they used to look in the other iteration. Or like Dudley, a really easy example is being able to combo off of his forward roundhouse overhead on characters that were standing in Street Fighter 4. Because in Third Strike, it was risky. If you did it and it was an overhead and it hit them while they were crouching, you got to do a super, you could blink off of it. If it hit them while they were standing, you got one move that you could chain off of it, but that was it. In SF4, you could combo off of it with standing roundhouse in both cases. It didn't matter whether they were standing or crouching, so there wasn't any downside to doing that move, not knowing what the opponent was going to do. It's the old games looked like this, so the new games should also look like this. Another favorite example of mine is the way that you tag in Marvel 3, right? The first way that they had it at the first public demos was back and assist, which meant, just like in TVC, where it was a bad idea to do it that way also, you couldn't assist while you were defending because you would tag. You had to actually let go of the block and then press assist in order to get the assist while you were on the defensive. So that was in the first public build. Then there was public feedback that was basically, why is this still this way? And they changed it. They changed it to holding down the assist button, which does things like, for example, allows you to immediately tag on wake up or after a super flash without having to time it at all. It also means that you can't reaction tag. You can't be like, oh, he's going to triangle jump. I would like to tag right now by pressing a button, right? You have to wait for it, just like charge moves. So it has disadvantages that it didn't have in other games. And they have, in that game, a button called Exchange. I think they called it Special now, but whatever. It was originally called Exchange. That you could press along with the assist button, and you wouldn't get an assist when you press the Exchange button because you couldn't call them during that move. So I don't know why they didn't make tag just Exchange plus assist, but they didn't. And it's the fact that the first decision of having it as back and assist made it through their whole development process into the first public build without anyone saying this is possibly a bad idea. That stuff's scary from a development standpoint because it means that the team doesn't know how people are going to be playing the things that they're making.
Interesting.
So real quick, I know you were brought on board like as a programmer, but you also seem to have a great understanding like from a design standpoint as well. When you guys started kind of putting Skullgirls into full-blown production, did you design around the engine you had already written, or did you build the engine around kind of the design process, or both?
Sorry, I was not really a programmer. I was like a programmer and a designer. I mean, I did all the character scripting for Skullgirls, and like I helped design movesets and all that stuff. So I was basically both. The nice thing about the engine is that nothing makes it any certain way. Like a character is literally just a state machine, and they have hits and block types. But the game engine just reports interactions. Like you were contacted by a hit of this type last frame, and the character figures out whether they want to handle that in any certain way. There's like gravity and move interactions and how long stuff lasts and frame data and stuff has nothing to do with code. There's nothing that makes the Skullgirls engine a fighting game engine. It could be, I don't know, a top-down shooter engine instead. Like characters are just game objects that happen to do things that reflect being in a fighting game at this point. We didn't really have to design around the engine per se. I did definitely design around what I wanted the game to play like, right? I mean, I designed around Marvel 2 and Darkstalkers and Guilty Gear a whole bunch. But there wasn't anything like in the tech at that point that was specifically limiting us from doing anything that we wanted to do. Which so another thing, like we pitched to Axis, the U.S. people that ported BlazBlue, or that localized BlazBlue, and they at a point during the pitch, I demonstrated that our engine was modular by I took a character from another directory and I dragged them into the directory that the game was looking in, and presto, there was another character that you could pick and play as. And everybody in the room stopped me and looked at me, and they all said, "Do that again," because a lot of the times things are hard coded into the engine. I think one of the things is like how Arakune's course mode worked was hard coded, so it was very difficult for them to make a patch that would fix it. So they had to make it a whole second game. And I mean, I've heard stories that Street Fighter 4 was the same way at the beginning. Obviously, it's a lot more modular now because people are doing fan hacks. But like, if you write your tech properly, most of it shouldn't care what kind of game you're making. And like you look at things like the Unity engine, and it's the same way, right? You can make anything you want out of Unity because a game object is a game object. Well, our engine is basically the same way, but it's designed around 2D sprites. So we didn't have to design around the engine specifically, but our design process was fairly unique, I think. Like, from having worked at other studios, it was a lot less art-driven than most of them are. Like, the way that we built the character was we started by having the artists do brainstorming sessions. Like every Wednesday they would do paint chats and just draw the character doing random things. Like, you know, I'd get them going to the grocery store, or I'd get them punching somebody else in the face or whatever. And after a couple weeks of that, they would hand me, you know, 350 or 400 drawings of the character doing random things, and from there we would pick stuff that looked like this could probably be a hard kick, this could probably be a crouching medium punch, and to some extent it determined what the characters were, right? I mean, Sarabella has giant arms coming out of her hat, so a lot of the stuff that I got from them was her grabbing people and slamming them around, so she became a grappler. There was nothing that said that she was going to be a grappler beforehand. Like, Peacock could have gone a whole bunch of different ways, but she ended up getting a lot of, like, throwing minions and bombs and dropping anvils and shooting things, and so she ended up a zoning character. Parasol could have done the same thing.
We were just saying that was really cool. That's interesting how you guys went about that.
Yeah, and the really nice part about that is we didn't end up with anything. I mean, of course, there were drawings of the characters doing really random stuff, but we didn't end up with, like, Farmer Dan throwing a fireball out of his rake, because that's not something that the artist would draw because it's not in keeping with the character. But from that point, pretty much everything was gameplay driven. So we, after the initial brainstorm and we decided on moves, it would be things like, oh, we're missing crouching weak punch, so we need some variations for crouching weak punch, and then they would do that. It helped us get a lot of things that we wouldn't normally have gotten if I were just doing the design myself. For example, Sarabella's jumping weak punch is she flips up and, like, hangs off of the hat arms as the first hit, and then she punches downward a whole bunch of times if you mash the button, like Hokuto no Ken style, as the second part of the hit. And like, if you had just asked me what her jumping weak punch should be, I would just say, you know, standard jumping weak punch. She goes smack right in front of her, and that would be it. Because from a gameplay standpoint, it's equivalent. But we ended up with stuff that was a lot cooler looking because the artists were the ones designing what the move should be. From there, it was all gameplay. They would animate a rough version of the move that had, you know, 5 or 6 keyframes, and then we would put that into the game engine and time it so that it felt nice, and then they would get back, all right, so her standing hard punch is going to be 30 frames long, and it has to hit on frame 16, go. And from there, it was up to the animators to animate it however they thought it would look the best, but in keeping with the constraints of how it was actually going to work in the game. Because a lot of times when you work with animators that are not told how the move is supposed to work, you'll get all of this wonderful wind-up and all of this wonderful recovery on something that's supposed to be 6 frames long. And you just can't use most of it. But the nice part about being able to work with how it's actually going to function in the game is they can decide, you have 5 frames of startup. What's the thing that an animator would do with 5 frames to get this move to look the best that it possibly can? And it was fast. We actually had very few problems with the system. I was really surprised. Like, had very few times when a move totally didn't work. Like, there were 1 or 2 moves that we ended up getting almost all the way through, and then it was like just not helpful. A couple of them went to double because we already had animation assets that we could use for a different. But we had way fewer problems with this system than I think I've ever had on anything else. When it was just like, we need an animation for a guy getting into a chair, and they give you like a wonderful thing where he walks in the room and sits down in the chair or whatever, and then gameplay comes back and goes, nah, you have to be able to do it like whenever you hit the button. So then the animator goes and animates something way worse because they're angry at you for not using the first thing, and then you use that. We wasted surprisingly few resources, and it took a lot less time than I think we thought it was going to take.
Okay. So real quick, I know you had spent some time in the industry before hopping kind of onto the indie front. Do you think that time in the industry kind of helped lay the groundwork for how the flow of production should work? Or would you recommend to indie developers that they spend some time working on some of the bigger titles before going full-blown indie?
I definitely would recommend having experience on at least one ship game of some size backed by some actual publisher before you try and do things yourself, because there are lots of aspects of game development and software development and pretty much anything else with a deadline that are very difficult to deal with unless you've done something that you weren't in control of that had a deadline. Right? There's the concept of Valve time, right, which is or Blizzard time, which is the game ships when it's done. A lot of if you're developing your own game for iPhone or whatever, then yeah, the game can ship when it's done. If you're being paid by Kickstarter or publishers or anyone that expects it in any sort of time frame, then you have to be able to say it's good enough. You have to be able to say this feature is complete. You know, I might be able to do it really, really much better if I gave it another 2 weeks, but I can't give it another 2 weeks, so it's acceptable to ship it at this time. Examples with Skullgirls include stuff that we got reamed for, like not having in-game move list was a decision that we ended up having to make, right? We had time to implement a whole bunch of features. We had one UI guy that could do however much UI he could do in the 6 months that he was working on it. There were other screens and there was other stuff like being able to choose from rooms online that was much more important than having in-game move lists. So we had to make the decision not to have them, which a lot of reviews gave us crap for, but that's the reality of game development, right? If you have a year to do something, then when the year is up, you better be done doing the thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I find it a little bit of a shame that the move list was so heavily emphasized, because honestly, since it's been added, I don't think I've checked it maybe more than twice.
Yeah, I've looked at it
Hey.
once since it happened. So.
I agree that it is a useful feature to have when you are just starting to play the game. But I don't know. The way that I look at it, there were a bunch of reviews that were like, I would have given this game a perfect score, but there was no in-game move list, and you saw hitboxes sometimes when you tagged. And so now I can look at that review and be like, well, we fixed both of those, so I guess it gets a 10.
Okay. Well, I have a few questions, like, just in the context of other games, because I'm terrible at fighting games solely because, I don't know.
You're just
I'm
bad.
just bad.
Because you don't try.
Yeah, and so I don't play them as much, just because I'm bad at them. But so I was watching some like videos of interviews you had done with people, and you were just kind of like elaborating on how how extensive of a process it is to like balance different characters, and I couldn't help but be reminded of like StarCraft 2, because that's something I follow a lot. How they're always trying to just kind of keep the races, dynamic and different from each other, but balanced. Do you look to other game types for, just kind of inspiration or anything like that, and try and incorporate any of their strategy into like making characters who are balanced?
Actually, we totally did. So one of the things that we did on Skullgirls that other fighting games don't do, a lot of times because big companies also have to be secretive about what they're trying to do, right? Like, you don't want to announce the title a year and a half before it's going to come out and have people see it when it's, like, not skinned or anything, was we did extensive player testing everywhere. Like, I brought it to every tournament I went to. I had people come to the office and play it all the time. And, like, this is totally something that we got from the betas of RTSs and FPSs, where they put it out and everybody says this stuff is totally broken. It should get fixed. And because when you, as much as you yourself and your small testing team looks at all the aspects of the game that you can, I mean, I think I'm a creative guy, but I approach stuff in a certain way, right? And if there's a way that I'm not going to consider to approach a move, then I'm just not going to consider it, right? And an easy example is people are ending Peacock's block string with We Kick Bomb, because it's pretty safe on block. Like, in the initial development of Skullgirls, it didn't occur to me that people would do that it would actually give her a safe block string, until I watched people playing her and they sort of ended up at that. So when you take a game and you put it in front of 10,000 people at once, they will find many more things than you have ever thought possible. And this was at the point at which we did it, it was the openest fighting game development that's ever been done, right? It was everywhere. People saw it in all different states. People offered feedback. We took fan feedback. And that was something that we got from other game types, because other game types are a lot more open to letting their fans see it before it's actually done, because they're creating insanely complex systems that they can't hope to keep in check unless they empirically test all of them. As far as actual like balancing strategies and stuff like that, there was a really good talk by the Spore people. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the actual person at one of the GDCs, where he talked about I'm blanking on the terminology, I'm sorry, but it was basically the design of or allowing people to add parts to the character wherever they could add it, right? And how you end up with lots of stuff that's ugly, and you end up with stuff that looks like penises and whatever else. Some of it's on purpose, but whatever. So he talked about there was an intersection between everything that the game let players do was a large circle, and then what players thought was aesthetically pleasing was a smaller circle, and how they went about reducing the options of what you could actually do, like not allowing you to make asymmetrical limbs and a bunch of other stuff, not allowing you to attach limbs at weird angles in certain places, or like put a limb on your eye, to try to reduce the number of things that players could make that they would think was ugly. And that sort of thinking applies to a lot of other areas that's not just character design and sport, right? If you, for for example, in fighting games, if you give a character a move that's really good in a certain way that you think the players are going to use like a quarter of the time, or if you miss something like, for example, Arrowhead for Viper Beam, you can see players using things in ways that it wasn't intended to be used, and everybody just looks at the tactics that evolve in the game and says, well, I don't know if I really want to play that. Like role canceling is an okay example in CVS2. It helps balance the game a lot, but if you look at it, you're like, that Hadouken just beat that super. I don't understand why that happened at all. And you try to, whenever you're making anything, you are trying to make the players play it the way that you want them to play it. And I'm sorry, I feel like I've done a terrible job articulating this. My apologies. But it was a thought process that I took away from that talk was extremely useful and important. And I have done a terrible job explaining why.
Also, I know that there's like a big desire to like add additional characters and stuff to the game, and I'm sure that the like fan base is like ecstatic at that prospect. But I play a lot of like Team Fortress 2, and I know people were just all excited for the Manco store, and then once it came out, and now they've just got items rolling out all the time, people are like, man, fuck this game, it's not balanced anymore. And I was just wondering if like you've like thought about that. Like any kind of like negative repercussions that could come with adding to the game that people already like feel really strongly about.
Well, there's definitely the negative repercussion of like, well, you didn't include the character at the beginning, and I don't really want to pay more for the game, but that's one of those things like, you know, oh, well, now I can buy this hat that gives me invincibility. I mean, that's not actually a thing, but, you know, stuff like that. People look at it as you're charging me for things that you should have included for free. I know that's not a balancing problem, but that's another one of those like game logistics problems, right? If we had had an extra year of development time, then we would have finished 8 more characters, but we didn't have that, so the starting roster was what it was. In terms of actual balance, I guess maybe I'm unique in how I look at balancing fighting games, but like it's another one of the things that I took away from, this one was FPSs specifically, or like RPGs. If you look at a game instead of as characters, but as situations, right, it's easier for me to give examples in fighting games because I just finished with one. For example, a character is throwing a projectile at you from full screen. What can you do about it? Or a character is menacing you on wake up and can mix up between a low hit and a throw. Or a character is constantly harassing you with air dashes. Like, how does the character that you're designing deal with these different situations, right? If you're being hit from both sides, or you're being forced to block and someone is going to leave you a small hole, how does this character handle that situation? Can every character handle the situations that come up in fighting games in some way? I mean, obviously some characters are going to be better at it. Like Peacock has very few options when you actually get up close to her, because she's supposed to not let you get up close to her. But she's still not helpless when you get up close, because we gave her something that allows her to deal with rushdown. If you approach the game as situations like this, then, for example, adding a DLC character doesn't add new situations into the game, right? They're not going to, I mean, unless you do something like you give them an unblockable attack that you shouldn't do in the first place, they're not going to suddenly be able to throw a projectile at you that works differently than all of the other projectiles in the game. It's a hitbox that overlaps you at some point. They're not going to suddenly be able to rush you down differently than other characters could ever do. They're not going to suddenly be able to call 3 assists at once or do anything that adds new situations to the game if you approach the situations properly. So I'm sort of confident that if you add other characters and you approached your initial design right, they exploit the existing situations in different ways, but they don't create things that other characters suddenly can't handle if they could handle the situations that you had in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does.
So real quick, out of curiosity, I'm sure this has been asked 1,000 times, but within your initial cast of characters, Is there any specific reason you guys went for having an all-female cast? Or, because I understand that you guys may be adding some male characters down the road with DLC.
Panzer?
Yeah, the cast was initially female because Alex wanted them all to be female.
Cool.
All right, good enough for me.
Yeah, it's good enough.
Are you allowed to say how far down the road of DLC will we see males?
I probably shouldn't.
Okay, don't mention it. Don't mention it.
Don't wanna get in
All right.
trouble.
Because I know DLC right now is in a bit of turmoil, and I don't want to nix that any further.
Yeah. Once again, never give up your IP.
All right, that's what we'll call this. Interview with Mike Z. Don't give up your IP.
Yeah.
And then, so I understand there has been some controversy regarding Autumn and the old Reverge crew. Is there anything that you would want to explain to anybody, like any development, so that they don't make those same mistakes? Besides, don't give up your IP.
Let's see. Don't give up your IP. Don't work with someone you don't know, or I guess work for someone you don't know if you don't have to.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out how to put this all really nicely. Honestly, don't give up your IP covers the majority of the problems that we have had. Because if we could take the game to other publishers, like as soon as we signed with Autumn, we got interest from like Sega and Capcom.
Capcom, really? I thought you would have gone in first.
Yeah, it's the same thing of like everybody wants to go into a busy restaurant, right? So as soon as it was shown that someone could possibly be interested in this, then other people were interested in it. But at this point, it's not ours, so we can't take it elsewhere and do more stuff with it. So I guess one of the other things that I would say is there are certain tactics that are advocated in the business world, like one of them is, I mean, there are things that are advocated like under-promise and over-deliver, which are actually good ideas, but there are things that are advocated in the business world, like if you have a budget projection, telling people that would be funding you that your budget is going to be slightly lower than it will actually be, and then like raising your cost throughout the project by like, oh, this went over what we thought it was going to cost by, 5 cents, and this went over what we thought it was going to cost by $10 or whatever, which may, people think may help you land a project at the beginning, right? Because you're telling them that it costs less than it's actually going to cost, but they don't know that, so you're just telling them that it costs less.
So in actuality, it's probably better to say right up front you need a little bit more money than what you may actually need.
Yeah, or at least what you actually think you're going to need.
Yeah.
Like, never, don't be disingenuous in this particular way because, or I guess this goes back to the don't work with people that you don't know because you don't know whether they're going to be disingenuous in this particular way or other particular ways. But if the project is really going to cost some amount of money, there is no downside to telling people that it is what it was going to cost. Because if they sign you and you told them it was going to cost half of that, they're still going to end up paying all of it, or they're going to end up dropping you in the middle. And if you tell them that it's going to cost more than they think it should cost at the beginning, then they can work with you to get the budget down. But I guess the takeaway from this one is lying is never a good idea.
All right. Well, we'll listen to our preschool teachers and
Exactly.
keep that in mind. How much of the original team is at Lab Zero and made the transfer from Reverge? I know you, probably Alex, Peter.
So I'll answer that a different way, which is this. The group that I was working with, including Alex and the initial animators and all of that, basically the Skullgirls team is Lab Zero. Reverge was someone that I knew that Alex and I decided to work with at the beginning because he already had a company set up. And it's much easier to talk business with companies when you already have a company set up, and we didn't know how difficult it was to set up a company. So the easy answer to that question is the entire Skullgirls team is at Lab Zero because the Skullgirls team was separate from Reverge kind of throughout the whole thing. That makes more sense. Like, I did not found Reverge, and Alex did not found Reverge, so we didn't, like, leave people there. They were people that we joined that we are no longer joined with.
Okay, well, judging by the name, I'm guessing you guys started Lab Zero?
Yeah.
Okay, very cool. Okay, how do you prepare mentally for maybe a big project or like a big kind of obstacle to tackle? Is there something kind of do for yourself? Kind of get yourself psyched up, plan ahead, write notes down, something.
Gonna kind of sound weird, but like watch Song of Rage. So, for those of you who don't know, since the title sounds mildly provocative, Song of Rage is a Third Strike tutorial video. About 12. Not, I'm just going to skip what it's not. Anyway, like, honestly, for a project, I don't really prepare because from the moment that I'm interested in it, I'm working on it, right? Like, I was thinking about how Skullgirls could possibly work. I was writing documents. I was annoying the heck out of everybody that wasn't yet doing work. Like, excitement is a big part of it for me, right? I know me, and if I'm not motivated to work on something, I have a very hard time getting myself to actually do it. So I've learned to just be honest about, like, I am not excited about this at all, so I'm just going to start on it, and we'll see what the heck happens. But if I'm excited about it, then great. I just, like, begin right away. For like, obstacles, I kind of enjoy that. Like, I guess I'm one of the people that looks at bugs and problems way differently from everybody else. Like, the people that were on Skullgirls can tell you, when the testers would come to me with a bug, or like they finally managed to reproduce something that had happened once like 5 months ago, I would be really excited about it. As opposed to a lot of the programmers that I knew where they're like, oh God, there's this bug that I have to fix and it's going to be awful and now I have to track it down and ugh. For me, they finally found out how to do this thing that we already knew was wrong. So now I'm really excited because now I can actually fix it. And I love hearing about problems with things. I love hearing about stuff that can be improved because it means that the product gets better at the end. And especially like when they finally come to you with a way to actually reproduce the problem, it means that you can fix it, right? The hunting is never fun, but like actually being able to do something to improve the game is great, even if it's fixing a bug.
Okay, awesome. Well, hey, thank you very much. I think we're going to start wrapping things off. So,
okay.
Thank you very much for joining us today and for kind of talking about Skullgirls.
Thank you. I'm sure that was a lot longer than it was supposed to be. They always are.
Oh, don't worry about it. More content, the better.
Yeah, enjoyable.
Very cool. I'll see you on Thursday.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Keep an eye on our site. We'll have more information on Skullgirls, more podcasts to come.
Thank you very much for tuning in. Take care.
Thanks, guys.